procedure which allows you to execute commands. So it's a pretty convenient way to take over a PC, and there are usually a couple of those out there. And other database servers as well. Missing patches is quite an obvious one. We obviously still see those a lot. These are some of the usual suspects from Microsoft. And the latest one, MS-08067, is the last one in the line of remote code execution without authentication on SMB or RPC ports. So you just talk to some default Microsoft port on a system that has those open, and you can execute codes unless they've installed a patch. That patch was released in October last year, I think. Microsoft suddenly announced they were going to release a patch, and they weren't even going to wait until next Patch Tuesday because people were already exploiting it and writing worms for it. And it's also the one that Configure exploits, so we know how popular that is. But even if the patch management of Windows systems is all okay and everything's patched nicely, usually you find third-party applications, and these are also some of the usual suspects. Trend Microservice Protect, for example, Backup Exec. If you haven't patched these, and they listen on some high port on your server, and some guy has figured out that they're somehow vulnerable, and you can toss code at them and get remote code execution as well. And these are a bit harder to patch because they don't come with your standard Windows updates, and you have to actually know what's on your servers, and that tends to be a problem at some companies. Sometimes you have to go to a bit more trouble, but there's always some little thing. For example, Cisco announced a couple of months back now, I think, that there was a directory traversal in one of their TFTP servers, the one that comes with Cisco Works. And I decided to take a look at this, how hard or how easy is it to trigger this bug. And it turns out to be pretty easy. You just put ..backslash, ..backslash, and you can traverse directories all the way to the system root and grab their bootpen.ini or something. And you can read files, and you can't create new files, but you can overwrite files. And the TFTP server runs a system, so the high privilege user. So I decided to look for an interesting file to overwrite or to get. So to get basically instant compromise. And it turns out Cisco Works also comes with an Apache server, which also happens to run a system. And most of the Apache server is password protected, but there are some CGIs you can access without having to enter a password. And 404.pl is one of those, an error CGI. And you can simply override them with a directory traversal exploit and override that CGI, and then visit the target from your web browser, execute the CGI, and you're executing code as system. And well, you can imagine what you can do then: add users, metasploit payloads, anything you want. And it's basically a miracle that they released the patch only now. It has been in there for years, and even when you toss a Nessus scan at that system, it'll find it. So once you're on a couple of systems, or maybe even one, what I like to do is steal the keys. And when I'm talking keys, I mean passwords. Usually plenty of passwords on systems you compromise. For example, a lot of companies still install VNC on workstations for some reason, and usually share the password between systems, and VNC password is usually easy to find, easy to crack, and you can do lots of fun stuff with that, or some other remote administration tools. If you compromise a development database server, for example, which are usually not that well protected, some Oracle system or something, you often find passwords that work on other systems, on production database servers, for example. So it's a nice way to go from development systems to production systems. One thing you'll always find is local administrator passwords on Windows system. And the local administrator password, local administrator account is hardly ever disabled. And why do I think these are evil? Well, I think in about 90% of all networks, those passwords are shared between machines, at least some machines, which is somewhat logical because in large networks you don't go around with CDs to every machine and install Windows and click next, next, next. you create an image and you deploy it to all those systems. And that local administrator password is often shared. So when you compromise the one machine, the one workstation, you crack that local password, and it turns out you can log into the next system, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And if you're really lucky, it will also work on servers, so compromise one workstation and get into a server. If you're really, really lucky, and I've been really, really lucky, it also works on the domain administrator. So don't do that. So how easy is it to crack these passwords? Most systems have the backwards compatible format enabled, the LM hash. And this is an easy to crack format. It's enabled by default up to and including Windows 2003. Vista doesn't store it anymore by default. Windows 2008 doesn't as well. Windows 7 probably doesn't do it as well. And it's for good reason. You don't really need this anymore. It's for communicating with legacy systems. And with legacy, I mean Windows 98 and early NT4 versions, things like that. Well, to compare on how easy it is to crack the old format, the LM format, and the NTLM passwords. With an LM password, you can crack a password up to 14 characters, and basically with everything that's on a keyboard, and that's reasonable. And there are now rainbow tables with even some strange characters in them. They've been recently released, and a colleague of mine, Daniel, worked on those. But basically, you can crack, dare I say, every, now not Chinese, for example, but most LM passwords you will easily crack, because 14 characters is also the maximum. So if someone has a longer password, the LM hash will not be stored. But if you find only an NTLM hash, 8 characters is where rainbow tables exist in not a really large character set, mixed alpha space. If you want to crack a 9-character password, you basically allow limited to alpha space, and 12 characters if it's just numeric, but how often does that happen? So if NTLM is enabled, it's harder to crack those passwords, unless of course they're using dictionary words or something, but brute forcing them is hard. But luckily there was a guy in 1997 that came up with a technique to circumvent cracking the password. What Windows basically does is when you authenticate to some share and you type your password, it hashes the password on your computer and uses that to authenticate to the share. So it uses the password hash to authenticate. So if you have those password hashes, they're basically password equivalents, at least in the case where you're enabled to SMB and shares. So there are public tools out there. There were public tools out there in 1997 to do this. If you just have the password hash, you don't need to crack the password, but you can just use the hash to authenticate. It doesn't work in all cases. If you want to RDP, a remote desktop to a system, you'll still need the plain text password. So you'll still need to crack it then. But yeah, really powerful technique, and already in 1997. Wow. And I wouldn't be surprised if worms actually started using this. That when you get a worm on your system and it looks at local administrator passwords, maybe tries to crack them, and if it can't crack them, just pass the hash along to other systems near it, and well, I think this could cause major problems on a lot of networks. Also a nice technique is token stealing.